Picture this. It's 1916 in Hawaii, and thousands of people are being ripped from their families and exiled to a remote peninsula, trapped between ocean cliffs and the sea. Their crime? Getting sick. For centuries, leprosy meant a lifetime sentence of isolation, with no hope of ever returning home. But one young woman, just 23 years old, figured out how to change everything. She developed the first treatment that actually worked, giving patients their lives back and reuniting families that had been torn apart. You'd think someone who saved thousands of lives would be celebrated, right? Well, here's the twist that makes this story almost unbelievable. After she died, a university president literally stole her work, published it under his own name, and for nearly 80 years, the world forgot she ever existed. This is the story of Alice Ball, and I need to tell you up front, what happened to her will make you angry, but it's also one of the most inspiring scientific breakthroughs you've probably never heard about. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why her story matters more now than ever. Because this isn't just about one woman or one disease. This is about how history gets written, who gets remembered, and what we lose when brilliant minds are silenced. To really understand the magnitude of what Alice Ball accomplished, we need to transport ourselves back to early 1900s Hawaii, because the situation there was absolutely devastating. Imagine being diagnosed with a disease and immediately, that same day, being forcibly removed from your home. No time to say goodbye properly, no appeals, no second opinions. You're just gone. That's exactly what was happening to leprosy patients in Hawaii, and it had been happening since 1866. The Hawaiian government had established a colony on the Kalaupapa Peninsula on the island of Molokai, and once you were sent there, you weren't coming back. The geography itself was designed to keep people trapped, steep cliffs rising 2,000 feet on one side, and nothing but ocean on the other three sides. It was a prison without bars. And by the time Alice Ball started her work, thousands of people were living there under conditions that were, frankly, inhumane. Families were destroyed. Children grew up without parents. Parents lost their children. The psychological trauma was immeasurable, and all of this was happening while doctors had absolutely no effective treatment to offer. Now, here's what makes this even more heartbreaking. There was a potential treatment that had been used for centuries in Asia. It was called Chaulmoogra oil, extracted from seeds of a tree native to South and Southeast Asia. The problem? It was basically unusable. The oil was so thick and sticky that swallowing it caused severe nausea and vomiting. Applying it to the skin barely helped at all. And when doctors tried to inject it, it was so viscous that it caused painful abscesses under the skin, sometimes making things worse than the disease itself. So you had this compound that seemed to have some therapeutic properties, but nobody could figure out how to actually get it into patients' bodies in a way that would help rather than harm them. This is the impossible challenge that was sitting there unsolved when a young African-American woman walked into the chemistry department at the University of Hawaii. Alice Augusta Ball was born in Seattle in 1892 into a family that was absolutely remarkable for their time. Her grandfather, James Presley Ball Sr., was a renowned photographer who had documented the Civil War and even photographed Frederick Douglass himself. Think about that for a moment. This was a Black family in America achieving significant professional success during one of the most oppressive periods in the country's history. Her father was both a lawyer and a photographer, and the family's work with photography meant young Alice was exposed to chemistry from an early age. Those old-school photo-developing processes involved complex chemical reactions, and watching her family work with these chemicals probably planted the seeds of fascination that would shape her entire life. When Alice was still young, her family actually moved to Honolulu temporarily because her grandfather was suffering from arthritis, and they thought Hawaii's climate might help. They eventually returned to Seattle, but this early connection to the islands would prove to be one of those strange turns of fate because Hawaii is exactly where Alice would end up making history. Back in Seattle, Alice was that student, the one that made excellence look effortless. She graduated from high school and then did something that was virtually unheard of for any woman at the time, let alone an African American woman. She pursued higher education in the sciences. At the University of Washington, she didn't just get one bachelor's degree, she earned two. One in pharmaceutical chemistry in 1912 and another in pharmacy in 1914. To put this in perspective, less than 2% of American women had bachelor's degrees at all. Alice had 2 degrees in fields that were actively hostile to female participation. Chemistry labs were considered unsuitable for women. Many universities explicitly barred women from chemistry programs. And yet here she was, not just participating, but excelling. Her work was so impressive that she caught the attention of faculty members at the College of Hawaii, which would later become the University of Hawaii. They offered her a scholarship to pursue a master's degree, and she accepted. But this wasn't just about continuing her education. By accepting this position, Alice was about to become a pioneer in ways that would have seemed impossible just a generation earlier. When she arrived in Hawaii and began her graduate work, she became the first woman to teach chemistry at the university. She was also the first African American to hold a teaching position in the chemistry department. She was breaking barriers just by existing in that space, and she was only 25 years old. For her master's thesis in 1915, Alice chose to investigate something deeply connected to Hawaiian culture, the kava plant, used in traditional Polynesian medicine. Her thesis, titled The Chemical Constituents of Piper methysticum, demonstrated something crucial about her approach to science. She was interested in how plants could be used as medicine, and she had a particular talent for isolating and analyzing chemical compounds from natural sources. This wasn't just academic curiosity. She was developing the exact skills that would soon be needed to solve one of medicine's most stubborn problems. And here's where fate intervenes in the most extraordinary way. Right around the time Alice was completing her master's work, a surgeon named Hari Holman was working at Kalihi Hospital in Honolulu, treating leprosy patients. Dr. Holman had been wrestling with the Chaulmoogra oil problem, and he knew that somewhere, somehow, there had to be a way to make this oil work. He'd heard about this brilliant young chemist who had just demonstrated remarkable skill at isolating plant compounds, and he approached her with a request that must have sounded almost impossible. Can you figure out how to make Chaulmoogra oil injectable? Think about what he was really asking. The medical community had been trying to solve this problem for decades, maybe even centuries. The best minds in medicine had looked at this oil and essentially given up. And there was Alice Ball, fresh out of her master's program, being handed this challenge that had stumped everyone else. Most people would have been intimidated, maybe even declined to try. But Alice looked at this impossible problem and saw something everyone else had missed. She saw a puzzle that she could solve through pure chemistry. Now, I'm going to tell you how she did it, and I want you to appreciate how brilliant the solution was. But first, let me tell you about what was at stake, because understanding that makes what comes next even more powerful. Every single day that passed without a treatment for leprosy meant more families being torn apart. There was a man who watched his wife being taken to Kalaupapa, knowing he'd probably never see her again. There were children who grew up in the colony without their parents, and parents who lost their children. The psychological trauma was immeasurable, and all of this was happening while doctors had absolutely no effective treatment to offer. Now, here's what makes this even more heartbreaking. Many of these people weren't actually severely ill when they were diagnosed. Early-stage leprosy is often mild, but the policy was immediate isolation regardless of severity. So you could have a small patch of discolored skin, and that was enough to have your entire life destroyed. The fear of leprosy was so overwhelming that it justified separating families permanently, creating this prison colony where hope went to die. When Alice Ball started working on the Chaulmoogra oil problem, she wasn't just working on a chemistry experiment. She was working on a key that could unlock those prison doors and give people their lives back. The pressure must have been enormous, but she had something that other researchers didn't have: a completely fresh perspective and a willingness to approach the problem in a fundamentally different way. So here's what Alice did, and this is where her genius really shines through. The problem with Chaulmoogra oil was its physical properties. It was too thick, too oily, not water-soluble. It couldn't be absorbed properly by the body. Most researchers had been trying to find ways to administer the oil as is, maybe mixing it with other compounds or finding different delivery methods. Alice looked at it completely differently. She thought, what if I change the oil at a molecular level? The oil contained fatty acids that seemed to be the therapeutic agents, but those fatty acids were locked in chemical bonds that made them impossible to work with. Alice developed a process called esterification. She isolated those fatty acids and converted them into ethyl esters. Now, if you're not a chemist, that might sound like technical jargon, but here's why it was revolutionary.
The oil contained fatty acids
ethyl
that
esters
seemed
had
to be
the exact same
agents,
therapeutic
but those fatty
properties as
acids
the
were
original
locked in
fatty
chemical
acids,
bonds that made
but they
them
were
impossible to work
water-soluble.
with. Alice developed a process called esterification. She isolated those fatty acids and converted them into ethyl esters. Now, if you're not a chemist, that might sound like technical jargon, but here's why it was revolutionary. The ethyl esters had the exact same therapeutic properties as the original fatty acids, but they were water-soluble. They could be easily absorbed by the body. They could be injected without causing pain or abscesses. She had taken this impossible compound and transformed it into actual medicine. Remember, she was doing this in 1915 without any of the modern analytical tools we have today. No spectroscopy, no chromatography, none of the high-tech equipment that modern chemists rely on. She had to identify the active compounds, determine their chemical structure, and develop a process to modify them while preserving their therapeutic properties, all using the basic laboratory equipment available at the time. And she did it in just a few months of focused research. When the first patients received injections using the ball method, something remarkable happened. They started getting better. Not just a little better, significantly better. Skin lesions began to heal, nerve damage stopped progressing. The disease that had been considered a life sentence suddenly had an answer. And here's the most beautiful part. Patients who had been locked away in Kalaupapa, who thought they would die in exile, started being released. They went home. They were reunited with their families. Between 1919 and 1923, the number of patients released from Hawaii's leprosy facilities increased by nearly 80%. Alice Ball, at 23 years old, had accomplished what the entire global medical community had failed to do for centuries. She had turned hope into reality. She had given people their lives back. Well, here's where this story takes a turn that honestly makes my blood boil, and I want you to sit with this for a moment because it's important. In late 1916, Alice was teaching a laboratory class when something went terribly wrong. Some accounts suggest she inhaled chlorine gas, a horrific accident that can cause severe respiratory damage. Other sources point to broader health issues, but the exact details have been lost to history, which is itself a tragedy. What we know is that she became seriously ill and had to return to Seattle to be with her family and try to recover. On December 31st, 1916, just 1 year after developing her breakthrough treatment, Alice Ball died. She was 24 years old. Let that sink in for a moment. 24. She had barely began her career. There's no telling what else she might have discovered, what other lives she might have saved, what other barriers she might have broken. The world lost a brilliant mind far too soon, and that alone would be tragic enough. But what happened next transforms this from a tragedy into an injustice. Arthur Dean, the president of the College of Hawaii, took Alice's research and continued working on it. Now, on the surface, that might seem reasonable. Someone needs to carry on important work when a researcher dies. But here's the part that's unforgivable. Dean published the findings without crediting Alice Ball. In fact, he put his own name on it and called it the Dean method. For decades, nearly 80 years, the treatment that saved thousands of lives around the world was attributed to a man who didn't develop it, while the young woman who actually did the work was completely forgotten. The Ball method was shared with leprosy treatment facilities worldwide. It became the standard treatment and remained so until the 1940s, when sulfate antibiotics were finally developed. For almost 2 decades, Alice Ball's innovation was the only real hope leprosy patients had, and nobody knew her name. Medical papers reference the Dean method. Doctors learn the technique without knowing who actually created it. The history books moved on without her. This isn't just about one woman not getting credit for her work, though that would be bad enough. This represents a broader pattern of how scientific history has systematically erased or minimized the contributions of women and people of color. How many other Alice Balls are there? How many other brilliant minds solved crucial problems only to have their work stolen or attributed to someone with more power and privilege? We'll never know the full extent of what we've lost because so many stories were never preserved. But here's where something beautiful happens. In the 1990s, two researchers at the University of Hawaii, Catherine Takara and Stanley Ali, were studying the contributions of African Americans in Hawaii when they stumbled upon references to Alice Ball's work. They started digging deeper, piecing together her story from scattered fragments in old records. Slowly, painstakingly, they brought her out of obscurity. In 2000, the University of Hawaii finally formally acknowledged what Alice Ball had accomplished. They dedicated a plaque to her memory beside the school's only Chaulmoogra tree. The governor of Hawaii declared February 29th Alice Ball Day, making it the first time the state had honored a woman of color in this way. In 2007, the university posthumously awarded her the Regent's Medal of Distinction. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine added her to their frieze of prominent figures in public health in 2019. The University of Washington established a scholarship in her name. Most recently, a crater on the moon was named after her. These honors are important, but they also raise a painful question. Why did it take 80 years? Alice Ball's story forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we recognize achievement and whose contributions we value. She did everything right. She was brilliant, she worked hard, she solved an impossible problem, she saved thousands of lives, and still her story was nearly lost forever. The only reason we know about her now is because a couple of dedicated researchers in the 1990s refused to let her remain buried in history. But beyond the injustice, there's something profoundly important about what Alice Ball represents. She came from a family that had succeeded against incredible odds. She pursued an education in a field that actively didn't want her there. She worked at an institution where she was the first woman, the first African American in her department, breaking ground with every step. And despite all those barriers that would have stopped most people before they even started, she made a contribution to science that changed the world. Think about what that means. Think about how much human potential we've wasted as a society by creating barriers based on race and gender. For every Alice Ball who managed to break through despite everything working against her, how many other equally brilliant minds were stopped completely? How many discoveries weren't made because someone who could have made them never got the chance to try? The Ball method itself tells us something crucial about the value of diversity in scientific innovation. Alice approached the Chaulmoogra oil problem differently than the established researchers who had been working on it for decades. Maybe it was because of her unique educational background, combining pharmaceutical chemistry with her understanding of plant-based compounds. Maybe it was because she came to the problem fresh, without the preconceptions that years in the field might have given her. Maybe it was something about her specific perspective as someone who had to see the world differently just to survive and succeed in spaces that weren't designed for her. Whatever the reason, she saw a solution that others had missed, and that solution worked. This isn't just a feel-good story about representation. It's a practical argument for why we need diverse voices in science and every other field. Different perspectives lead to different approaches, and different approaches solve problems that seemed unsolvable. Alice Ball's work with natural compounds also remains relevant today. While synthetic drugs dominate modern medicine, we're seeing a renewed interest in plant-based medicines and natural products as sources for new treatments. The fundamental approach Alice used, isolating active compounds from plant and chemically modifying them to make them more effective, is still a key strategy in pharmaceutical development. She was pioneering a methodology that's still bearing fruit more than a century later. And leprosy itself? It's not gone. It's now called Hansen's disease, named after the scientist who identified the bacteria that causes it. And while it's treatable today, there are still hundreds of thousands of new cases diagnosed every year around the world. The stigma she worked to combat still exists in many places. The isolation and shame that patients experienced in her time haven't completely disappeared. Her work helped begin a shift toward more humane treatment, but that work isn't finished. So here we are at the end of Alice Ball's story, and I want you to take away 3 things. First, remember her name, Alice Augusta Ball. Say it out loud. She deserves to be remembered not as a footnote or a feel-good diversity story, but as a pioneering chemist who solved a problem that had stumped the world's best scientists. She saved thousands of lives, reunited families, and gave hope to people who had none. Second, think about the Arthur Deans of the world, the people who take credit for others' work, who use their power and privilege to erase contributions from people with less power and privilege. They're still out there. The fight for recognition and equity in science and every other field is ongoing. When we see injustice, when we see people being overlooked or erased, we have a choice to make about whether we speak up. And third, and this is the most important, think about what we lose as a society when we create barriers to talent. Alice Ball succeeded despite enormous obstacles, but she was one person. How many others didn't make it through? How many problems could we solve? How many lives could we improve if we actually created environments where everyone had a fair shot to contribute their gifts? Alice Ball completed her master's degree at 23, developed a life-saving treatment at the same age, and died at 24. In that impossibly short time, she changed the world. Imagine what she could have done with a full lifetime. Imagine what anyone could do if given the opportunity.
That's her legacy. Not just the treatment she developed, but the reminder that brilliance can come from anywhere. And our job is to make sure it's recognized and celebrated, regardless of who produces it. The world needs more Alice Balls. And more importantly, the world needs to actually see them, support them, and remember them when they change everything. The young chemist who died before her 25th birthday proved that one person, given the chance, can save thousands. Let's make sure we never forget that. And let's make sure we never let another Alice Ball be erased from history again.
If this story made you angry, if it inspired you, if it made you wonder who else has been erased, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Because if we don't tell these stories, who will? And if we don't remember these women, who else gets forgotten tomorrow? They can steal credit, they can rewrite papers, they can dominate textbooks, but they can't stop us from finding the truth and sharing it. That's why you need to subscribe to Women Erased. Let's rewrite history together.